Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans Podcast starts right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast. I'm Gus Kattengell with you. I'll be joined alongside with Jim Eichenhofer of NewOrleansPelicans.com. Pelicans coming into their final game of the month on a 3-game losing streak. Last time they were on the court, it was against the Boston Celtics in Boston. They had a 17-point lead in the game, then an 11-point lead, and then in the fourth quarter, they just could not close. And it's been one of the things that's been an issue so far this season. First off, head coach Willie Green overall on the defeat.
Give them credit first. You know, they turned it up in the second half. Tatum, Brown, the rest of those guys. Derek White hit some big shots. And that's what good teams do. They know that we were being physical to start the game. They were missing some shots. They stuck with it. So give them credit. And then, I loved our effort. I thought our effort, we executed well for maybe 3.5 quarters of the game. And we know our blind spots. We know that the last 5 minutes of a game we have to execute better and get quality looks. We had a few turnovers there down the stretch, and, that's where we have to grow.
The key point, 6 turnovers in the game, and that was an issue. It's been an issue, but 6 turnovers coming in the fourth quarter. Head coach Willie Green, not a fan of that.
I don't like the 6 turnovers at all. That's where we have to be more mature as a team. Come down, execute, get a quality shot. Our guys in the locker room, they know that. We've talked about it all season long. So I'm not happy with that part. For 3.5 quarters, we look pretty good. And Boston turned it up. That's another area for us. Like when the game goes to another level, we have to meet that challenge, and we fell a little short tonight.
All right, so Jim, as we bring you in here, obviously there was a lot of positives in that game. You win the first quarter. I thought Zion and BI looked really good in there, and then you saw a championship caliber team kind of step up to the case, and they did it the day right after too. They did it to the Pacers where they were trailing and wound up winning there as well. So how do you look at this game? Do you look at it as, hey, this is a situation where the Celtics, they're ready to compete for a championship, and the Pels are still kind of learning how to find their way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's symbolic of what we've seen a lot this season with the Pelicans, where there's two sides to the coin. On one hand, you see that they have the talent to have a double-figure lead over the Celtics in Boston in the fourth quarter, but then in clutch time, they're not able to make enough plays. And you mentioned the 6 turnovers. They also shot 50% from the field in the fourth quarter, but they were 2 for 10 on threes. So that was another thing that was really damaging to their ability to hold on to that lead, and then at the end to be able to make enough plays to win. So, I mean, it was good and bad. I thought, you continually see the talent that this team has and the ability that they can play with a Boston team for 40 minutes or 45 minutes, but then at the end, they're 6-10 now in clutch games, and I'm not sure how many in a row losses it is, but it's several losses in a row in the tight games, the clutch games. Early in the season, I think they were right around 500, but now they're 6-10 in those situations, so something that they have to improve.
No doubt. So we'll see if they do get a chance to do that here, as well as they will take on the Houston Rockets, and it's a team that has been a tough matchup. Why has it been a tough matchup, you think?
Yeah, and speaking of clutch time too, the losses to the Rockets were by 3 points and 2 points, so these were games also that came down to the end. The game in Houston, I think, was particularly frustrating because it was an in-season tournament game. The stakes were a little higher, and they had a lead in the last couple minutes. They really only needed to make maybe one more play to win that game, and they weren't able to do it. But back to your question as far as the difficulty of this matchup, somehow the Rockets have really been able to get both of the games so far much more to their style of play. The Pelicans are middle of the pack in pace across the NBA this season, but in the games against Houston, it's been way slower games. It's been way, more low scoring, kind of grudge matches, kind of 90s basketball or early 2000s where, it's harder to score and the Pelicans aren't really able to get out and run, which they want to do, and just use some of their athleticism. I think, they're a more athletic team than Houston. They're a deeper team than Houston. But when you play these slow-paced games, I think sometimes you don't see that come out in the action because it's just more of like an ugly, physical kind of game. So Houston has been able to, and also Alperen Şengün has averaged 30.5 points a game in the two matchups against New Orleans. So, I mean, he's just been really good. And, I mean, he's had a really good season. He's somebody that would be maybe an all-star contention in any other year or any other conference, but he's hurt the Pelicans a lot in these two losses that the Pelicans have had to Houston.
And let's not forget, too, as we saw in the other game, Dillon Brooks is one of those guys, too. Is he the new Draymond Green? Is he somebody you have to worry about in terms of knowing that at some point he's going to do something to kind of get under your skin, and he's sort of that energy level? He's kind of giving the Rockets an attitude, huh?
Yeah, he definitely has. I mean, one of the most impressive things about the improvement that they've made to me has been defensively. I think people that watched Houston play last season, the Pelicans won 3 of 4 against the Rockets last season. Their only win was on that Jabari Smith three-pointer in the final seconds of a game in Houston. They were just so disorganized and so just not fundamentally sound. They were a bad defensive team. A lot of it was they didn't get back even, which is like, one of the first steps to being a good defensive team is you got to get back on defense and not get beat with transition scores and not being matched up. So they really did not look like an NBA team last season in a lot of ways. And this year, in so many different categories, they're so much better. And I think Dillon Brooks that you mentioned and Fred VanVleet as well, those two guys have just made them a much more professional team and just more sound in a lot of different areas. As far as Dillon Brooks' stuff on the court, he is getting to the point where, he's like, I wonder sometimes if he's starting to get in people's heads because you're starting to worry about some of the dirty stuff that he's done, some of the stuff that's just out of bounds. And I think the comparison to Draymond is pretty good from the standpoint that you just watch him sometimes and you're like, it looked like he tried to make that look like it was an accident, but there's no way that 18 consecutive times where he's hit somebody in the face that they were all accidental.
And you think about that before you even go into the game. That's my point. I mean, I'm watching and doing the show yesterday, and NBA Today's has an entire segment. Was Dillon Brooks, doing this by accident or not? And there it is. It's him coming across LeBron's shoulder and, and LeBron's down on the floor and all of that. So you do go into it kind of knowing that. But I think that's the thing that I've seen with Houston this year. And especially they had a hot start at the beginning of the season. But it's just more of that nature of, hey, this is what they're going to try to bring. They're going to try to do that. And Mayo Daka, when he was with the Celtics, that was a very tough defensive-minded team. And so I do think that that's something to pay attention to today.
He's done a great coaching job. I think if there weren't so many other really good coaching jobs, he'd probably be a guy that people would say, this guy could win Coach of the Year. But he's done incredible. I mean, they won 22 games all of last season.
Incredible.
And they have 22 wins right now with 30-plus games left in the season. So, and they're also, I don't think they were a team going into the season that people thought, like, yeah, this is a play-in team. But if they win tonight, which, obviously we hope they don't, but if they win tonight, they're in 9th place. They're ahead of Utah and the Lakers with a victory. So, I mean, that's a credit to the work that he's done as a coach and just the improvement across the board that they've made in so many areas.
All right, time now to welcome in our guest, a very special guest. I love me some Oleh Kosel. And the way you spell it's Oleh Kosel. Jim, did you know that if I gave you a spelling bee, would you know how to spell Oleh Kosel?
I think I would, only because I've written it down a few times in preparation for having him as a guest. I as well love myself some Oleh Kosel, so very happy to see him and talk to him today.
I love that. I spelled it on purpose because that's how you go give a follow over there on X. Longtime Pelicans beat writer and covers the NBA as well. Here to help give us perspective. I had Oleh on the show earlier this week to talk about that, to help give me perspective. I knew this was going to be a tough month, Oleh. I knew you were going to face some of the top players in the NBA. You were going to face some of the top teams in the NBA. That said, here we are with one game left in the month and you're 7-7. How do you look at this month so far?
It's funny you brought this up because that's where I was going to start this show today. You asked me at the start of this month, what would you be happy with, right? Because this looked like this was going to be the toughest month of the year for the Pelicans. And I think we both agreed, right? Just getting to 8-7, that would have been good. Now, granted, they've had maybe a loss or two that either you're not happy with or maybe that they should have won, right? That's still a problem. But for the most part, yeah, you'll take this, right? If it's the toughest month and you've got a good chance, right, to finish over 500, I think you got to be happy with it.
So give me, I mean, based on your answer just there, you kind of hinted at this, but I was kind of wondering what on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your concern level, your concern meter right now, with 1 being, you're sitting back on a beach in a hammock, and 10 being it's the apocalypse right now for the season and that the fate of everything is at stake. Where are you right now on that scale?
Probably like a 2 or a 3. I mean,
Yeah.
there's obviously some problems, and I'm sure we're going to delve into them, like clutch time minutes, like being able to compete against the better teams, right? Maybe more so the elite teams in the league. But really, the Pelicans have taken a step forward from last season. And everybody knows you don't go from suddenly being, a 9 or a 10 seed, jumping all the way up to being a championship contender, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're a 1, 2, or a 3 seed. I know there's exceptions, and I know Gus brought up the Thunder, but that's the rarity. Mm-hmm. So they look to be taking that step for me, right? We've seen 45 games. The offense has steadily been improving. The defense has largely been there. The talent is obvious, right? Sure. Willie can't even play certain guys like Jose Alvarado and stuff. So, yeah, for the most part, if you can just iron out clutch time minutes, figure out how to make Brandon, Zion, and CJ more effective, especially in those crucial moments, that'll go a long way for this team.
You mentioned clutch time a couple times. I want you to put your Coach Kosel hat on and tell me what are either some of your solutions to how they can play better in clutch time, or what are some of the specific things that you want to start seeing them do better in that part of the game?
I think without a doubt, it has to be execution, right? You watch teams that have been together for a few seasons, the cores, like we just saw Boston and how they closed out. They look like they knew what they wanted to get out of every possession. Mm-hmm. So, yes, they've added Drew Holiday, Kristaps Porzingis, who didn't play, but obviously they've had a really good go of it so far this year, right? Being the top team in the league and having only 2 losses at home. So they're obviously all on the same page. That's where the Pelicans, I mean, most of the reasons I feel like the clutch time losses happen also is because they give up a double-digit lead. And remember, they were leading Boston by 10 points, I want to say, 10 or more points. So that's been kind of a theme this year, to where they get off to largely good starts and they can build leads, but they seem to relinquish them. And then for whatever reason, clutch time is also a problem. So like I said, it's execution. You can't have turnovers. And right now, they're one of the worst teams turning the ball over in those key moments. Suddenly, the open shots aren't going in either, guys. And that's a problem, because that stems to confidence for me. But largely, I want to see BI, CJ, and Zion somehow be able to lift up the entire team. So not only are they going to get good shots for themselves, but get open looks for the other team. So like when Tatum's coming down the court, he's going to try and take his man. He's going to try and get a mismatch. We saw that. But if he doesn't have it, he's trusting Derek White, who started 1 for 9 but finished 5 for 5, right? He was the guy that swung the tide, I felt like, in the fourth quarter. So Pelicans have to figure out a way. And I think that's why we've heard Willie so often this year bring up the word trust, right? How important it is. And we've seen it against, lesser competition where things are going well. The trust is there. The ball's hopping, shots are going in. But they've got, for whatever reason, got to get over that hump. And I think, yes, you could probably bring in a player, look through a trade market, but if you believe in this talent and you want to have BI and Z have the ball in their hands to finish games, then they're going to have to figure it out. And you still got almost half the season to do that.
You mentioned just now BI and Z. This is the time of the season where we start to hear and get a lot of the announcements that are related to All-Star Weekend, whether it's the All-Star game itself or, the Rising Stars, which we'll get into in a second. But what are your expectations for tomorrow in terms of All-Star reserves? Do you think that the Pelicans have a chance to get one of those guys in the game? And how do you kind of view that situation?
Yeah, that's tough, because had they stayed maybe with like 4 or 5, somewhere closer inside that top 6, you could have made a stronger argument. And also the fact that not one player has really separated himself, right, above the rest. Mm-hmm. The stat lines look similar. It's difficult to imagine, Jim. I thought if I had to pick somebody, I would have gone with CJ. Had he gotten to that 20-point plateau, and I looked at previous histories where players have shot or hit 20 points, I think 4 or 5 rebounds, 4 or 5 assists, and about 45% from the field and from 3, almost every single one of those guys, Jim, have made the All-Star game. But he's not there. Pels aren't there. That's
an interesting point as far as the cutoff. I agree with what you said, too, as far as there's a certain level in the standings that you reach where people look around and say, man, there has to be an all-star from this team because they're 3rd place or they're 4th place. And right now they're in 8th, but obviously it's very close. They can easily move up a couple spots soon, but it's still not at that point where you kind of are putting pressure on the coaches in this case where they vote for reserves to say when they fill out their ballot, like, oh man, I know I don't necessarily see a standout clear cut guy from the Pelicans, but they have to have somebody in that group. So, I mean, in all of the predictions I've seen too, I haven't seen any Pelicans mentioned. So I'm not expecting them to have someone, but I actually think it's okay. And this is something we talked about a little bit before and probably something we'll get into further down the road. To me, it's kind of a sequence now from a big picture standpoint, as far as if they start making the playoffs every year, you'll start to have guys make the All-Star game automatically, even if they are in 6th or 7th place in a given season. So to me, it's like, that's the first step now in terms of the team success and accomplishments have to come first now before the individual stuff does. I feel like they're at the point now from the league's perspective, as they view this team, as we're not going to give them a ton of individual recognition until they become a team that is winning in the neighborhood of 50 games a year, or is a team that's in the playoffs every year, not making it one year, missing it the next, so on and so forth. So I'm with you 100% on that one. In terms of another All-Star weekend deal, the Rising Stars announcement was yesterday, and Jordan Hawkins and Dyson Daniels were both selected among the participants to that game. What was your reaction to that announcement of them being picked for that game, or for that tournament, I guess it is?
Yeah, so deserving. That's the easiest word you can pick out for both of these players, right? We know what Dyson brings to the table. He's one of the most elite defenders, I think, in the league already, right? Just his second season. He showed what he could do last year, of course. But I feel like he's taken another step forward to where we're seeing where Willie's trusting him. So even though the offense isn't always there, right? He struggled kind of maybe getting the shots up, right? He doesn't always look for his shot. Let's put it that way. And it's holding him back a little bit. But like I said, you can't overlook everything else he's doing on the court. So it's not just the defense, his tenacity in rebounding, making plays for others. Almost every other box is checked, right? So he's a very deserving, right, second-year guy getting into that game. Jordan, that's a no-brainer, right? He's leading the league among rookies in three-pointers made. So he hasn't had the most consistent of roles, but he's easily been one of the top 10 rookies all season. So, yeah, shooting's at a premium, right? That's always probably the most valued skill if you were to ask any fan today. And Jordan can do that. And over this last month, during the month of January, he's shooting lights out, guys. I mean, I looked, just over 45% from three. So he's doing what he's being asked to do largely within the framework of the offense. And I don't know, I couldn't list probably 10 guys on both my hands that carry as much confidence, right, as Jordan. And it's so impressive, right? He's doing his first year. So yeah, I'm happy to see him.
I'm going to throw in a little caveat for you guys on here. I'm going to go first take here. I'm going to go scream the name for you.
Uh-oh.
You guys were talking about the All-Star and not having that. And I agree with you guys, right? I mean, when you look at some of the other guys that have been playing, and you even look at Ali, we talked about OKC, SGA. I mean, he's a starter this year and what that team's been able to do. So let me ask you both this, right? I'm going to go first take here. A little Chiron on the bottom goes, is it a problem that the Pelicans don't have an all-star player, or do they need an all-star player to take that next step? Or is it based off of this offense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you honestly do need to have somebody, right? So they've got candidates, namely you're looking at Zion and BI. And there's still a reasonable chance, right? Zion's told us he's not 100%, right, all season. Last time he was asked about that was about 80, a week ago.
He said 88%.
Yeah, 88, 89, 90. He was in that range. So you almost have to take him for his word on that. We saw, right, he was an MVP caliber type of player for about 6 weeks last year, right? He was in the news about it. We were asking Doc Rivers about it. A lot of multiple coaches were even saying his name. So we know what level he can play at, but he's not there yet. Same thing with Brandon. And I feel like with Brandon more so, I think he's kind of taken a step back in terms of shot attempts, being as aggressive, because he's trying to involve the rest of his teammates more. And so that's obviously going to take him out of that running, because, when you think of all-stars, you're thinking guys well over 20 points per game. And right now, Brandon doesn't seem to have that mindset. So, yeah, as we said, nobody clear cut, but I think in the future there can be. It all depends on how this roster comes together, guys. I mean, let's face it. Does Zeke's health get better? Do they take away some pieces either at the trade deadline or over the summer to where BI is going to be in that kind of scoring mentality again, 16, 18 shots a game? We don't know, but the potential is there, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, Ali, in terms of Gus's question. I mean, to me, there's kind of two sides to it. One, I do think that it is important that they have someone ascend to the all-star level. And I think, like you said, Zion is the most likely candidate because what we saw last season, his upside is just so high. I mean, when he's at his best, I mean, heck, he's been an all-star already twice, even though both of those seasons he only played basically a portion of the season. So the fact that he's been able to do that already tells me that it won't take a lot. And maybe just all it takes is him getting from the 88, 90% to 100% or very close to that. And he will be an all-star. The other side of the discussion to me, though, is I do think it's very possible that there will be a team or two in the Western Conference that is dangerous and goes deep in the playoffs and is a threat. And then when you look back at February, you say, man, they didn't have any all-stars, because just from the simple fact that if you look at the competition and you look at the talent, I think a lot of people if you just look at it just without actually researching it and looking through the list of players, you say, yeah, Zion's an all-star. Yeah, Brandon Ingram's an all-star. But then when you actually look through the list and you realize that how many guys, I've heard people make the argument in recent years that the all-star roster should be more than 12 players. And I think if you look at this year's Western Conference, it's like, this is one of the best cases ever for why they should expand it beyond just a dozen guys, because there's going to be tomorrow night when they announce the reserves, I guarantee you, I mean, not that this is a brand new thing, but there's going to be multiple players who people are like, wait, that guy's not an all-star after the year that he's had and after the first half of the season that this guy has had. I mean, look at Sacramento, which is a team that has roughly the same record as New Orleans. And I think a lot of people are debating, like, they go into the discussion saying like, oh yeah, Fox and Sabonis are definitely all-stars. But when you actually go through the list and see who needs to be excluded, I feel like a lot of people have said, man, it's tough to even get both of those guys on the roster. So it's important to kind of wrap it up, sum it up with my feelings. It's important to have someone to extend to that level. But I mean, I actually think that you can be a very good team in the Western Conference and be a threat in the postseason and not have an all-star guy picked.
Yeah, Jim, there's been teams like that in history, right? And I look at the Detroit Pistons, right? Even though some of those guys were all-stars previously, but when was it? Chauncey got together, Rip, Rasheed Wallace, they had Ben Wallace, all those guys. They weren't in there for the all-star bids, right? I don't know if they even made it together that season. They won it all. But there's teams been, to your point, like that can win a bunch of games, go deep in the playoffs without having that guy.
And specifically to this Pelicans team too, I think that the big three, they somewhat, I don't mean this in a negative way, but they somewhat suppress each other's stats because there's three offensive threats that are very primary guys. I mean, if you take one or two of those guys out of the mix over the course of the whole season, if Brandon Ingram is averaging 22, 23 points a game, all of a sudden his average is going to be 27 or 28. And people are going to look at the stats and say like, oh, how much better of a season has Ingram had because he's averaged so many more points. But it's really just the fact that there's two other guys around him that are so good that makes it hard for any one guy to really stand out. And I don't think that's a negative as far as having three players that can all, average 20 points a game. That's just the way this setup, I would love to be able to compare this team someday to the 04 Pistons, some of the players that you mentioned. But obviously they're not there yet, but this is the way this team is built is much more similar to that in terms of it's not one guy that puts up huge numbers. There's a bunch of teams in the NBA. I mean, the Mavs are one example, although they do have Kyrie as well. But I mean, teams that have a guy that can go for 60 or 70 points, but on a lot of nights, if he has a bad game or, the top two guys don't have huge nights, you're in big trouble because you just don't have enough depth around those guys. So obviously that's not the case at all with the Pelicans. It's just the way that this team is set up is different from that.
Yeah, and it's the way they approach the games, right? That's the thing I look at, because you just mentioned the three top scorers. I think Zion, BI, and CJ could honestly all average together more points per game. Look at what Kevin Durant, Bradley Beal, Devin Booker are doing. But of course, you're taking shots away from the rest of the guys. Of course, you're basically playing ISO ball or pick and rolls and just looking for your own. And that's largely what they do. Unless they have a wide open kick out, those guys are always trying to score. So that's why I like the system that's here, that the guys are actually in tune with it and following it, because suddenly Trey's getting opportunities. Jordan, we're seeing Herb, right, stand out. And then you got Jonas. We never even talk about Jonas, it seems like, when we talk about this scoring team. But here's the best example. Pelicans put up a franchise record 153 points the other night. The leading scorer was 33 points, if I'm not mistaken, by CJ. So there you go. That's a clear delineation of just how the Pelicans play and want to play. And when they're at their best, that's what you should expect to see.
Ollie, my final thing for you here as well is obviously there's going to be so much attention going into next week's trade deadline with other teams here as well. So LeBron posted an emoji of an hourglass. I have no idea what that means. Maybe the next time we have you on, we'll ask you what emoji would you post, to describe this team or not. But I think what's interesting is I don't know what other teams are going to do. I don't know what the Pels are going to do. I brought this up to Jim earlier, I think this week on the podcast, if not at the end of last week. When I look at the standings, Ollie, what's interesting is there's so many teams jumbled and close that I almost don't know what you go do for a lot of those other teams, right? To go get it. And I mean, like for the Suns, it was just, you got to get those three guys together. You still got Steph in them, when you're looking at Golden State. I mean, the top 3-4 teams in the West, they've been pretty consistent with what they do. I don't know if OKC needs anything or Minnesota, plus here's the other element of it. When you look at the East, I mean, the Knicks, they think they were 14-2 in the month of January here as well. I mean, what do they sort of need? Is probably need Julius Randle to get back. I don't know if I'm going to see, I guess what I'm getting at, Ollie, Woj bombs or, him and Sham going back and forth with a bunch of big names being moved. Do you expect next week and the trade deadline to be more about pieces, rebounder or three-point shooter or defender, as opposed to, oh my gosh, look at these franchise players moving names and moving franchises? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm expecting. Look, first you have to just look at the names that are already being mentioned. And the biggest names seem to be DeJounte Murray, Zach LaVine, right? Those players, D'Angelo Russell. No more Kyrie Irving, right? And certain other players. Good point.
So that's the one point. The other thing you have to look at, of course, is exactly what you said. All the teams that have made the major moves are largely doing well. So outside of maybe Atlanta, outside of Golden State, and really with Golden State, it's hard to see that they're going to split that team up, right? It would take something seismic, I feel like. So they're not going to give up on Steph, Draymond, Clay. So when you look past them, there's really nobody left, right? So no disgruntled superstars. And that's a good thing. I'm enjoying this, by the way, for the first time in a long time.
It's a good point.
So no, it's going to be teams still trying to figure out what they need around the edges. And for the Pelicans, I mean, look, we just talked about what are the issues? Majorly clutch time, right? Crucial moments. So can you get a leader, right? Another leader on his team, maybe at the point guard position. I know that, right, center is not ironed out for the long term, but otherwise, no. You're not going to see these teams that have done largely well, taking the next step this season from last, and all of a sudden do a seismic change. And I think you have to include the Pelicans in that group.
Because it kind of just shows the strength of the league, doesn't it, guys? That you don't have a lot of disgruntled players or guys that want to leave and are openly doing that, like we saw with the Nets last year and things of that nature. So that is good, And again, I'm just making sure that we don't have a new emoji for the Lakers with LeBron over here. Just making sure. Anyway, Oleh Kosel, as always, enjoy the coverage, man. Enjoy the time at OLEHKOSEL. That is the way to go give a follow to Mr. Oleh Kosel over there on X and, of course, across all the other social media platforms. Thank you for your time, man.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. And look, for all those Pels fans that got a little worried over the 3-game losing streak, look at the next upcoming 8 games. A lot of winnable games where they could run off 6 of 8 because they're facing the East, a lot of lesser competition.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I think it's changed maybe now, but as of going into this road trip, they had played the least games against the East. So that's something that we're definitely going to monitor. I mean, just because the East is weaker than the West doesn't mean you're going to reel off a ton of wins, but hopefully they're able to do that. And on paper, like you said, they just went through the toughest January, I think, in the league opponent wise. And the second half of the season is a lot more manageable. Now it's just a matter of they have to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Stay healthy. Why not?
Yeah, that's true. And that's something they've been able to do. Zion's played 38 games out of 47. So it's, better than not. Go ahead, knock on wood. Everybody knock on wood real quick. Oleh Kosel, as always, man, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, bud.
All right, guys. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Oleh.
All right, our thanks to Oleh Kosel for kind of going over some of the things that are going to be talked about here the next couple of days, especially when it comes to the All-Star break, All-Star weekend, trade deadline next Thursday. What are some of the teams that are going to do all of that? But it is Western Conference Wednesday, which means what, Jim?
It means it's time to look at the team to watch. And first, before I get into the team to watch this week, which is the Dallas Mavericks, I want to go back to last week. It was the Phoenix Suns. That was the squad that I picked. And at the time, they were on a 6-game winning streak. They did win that night last Wednesday at Dallas by 23, which was a really good victory. But the curse of the team to watch kicked in at that point, and they lost at Indiana by 2 on Friday, at Orlando by 15 on Sunday. They did win at Miami in their most recent game by 13. But, I mean, they lost 2 games over the weekend where Devin Booker, one of them he had 62 points. A game against Orlando, I think he had 44 or 45. So when you get one of your players scoring over 100 points over a 2-game span, but you still lose both of those games, that's pretty tough. Right now, the Suns are 27-20, which is 1 game ahead of the Pelicans. So curious to see how the rest of the season goes, whether the Pelicans can kind of hang with them in the standings. For a while there, it looked like the Suns were going to take off and really kind of create a bunch of separation between themselves and a few of the other teams that are in this tier of the standings. When I say that, I mean, Sacramento, Dallas, and the Pelicans. But right now, it's still pretty close. The Suns also have 3 more games on this 7-game road trip. They have Brooklyn, which is an ABC game tonight, at Atlanta, and at Washington. So going to continue to watch them and see if the Pelicans can, stay right there with them in the standings. But team to watch this week over the next 7 days is the Dallas Mavericks. They are 26-21, which is the exact same record that the Pelicans have right now. They have the upper hand in the standings because of the tiebreaker, which is going to be division record since the Mavs and Pels went 2-2 against each other. One of the reasons I picked the Mavericks for this week coming up is their schedule is very difficult. They're at Minnesota tonight, best team in the Western Conference. They're home on Saturday against Milwaukee, second best team in the East. And then on Monday, they're at Philadelphia, which is also a top 4, top 5 team in the East. So pretty similar to what the Pelicans actually just went through with a 3-game losing streak where they're playing some of the best teams in the league. The Mavericks close out this next 7-day span at Brooklyn on Tuesday, which I believe is a TNT national game. But before that, they're playing, some really quality teams. So I'll be curious between now and next Wednesday when we meet again, whether the Pelicans have moved ahead of them in the standings, because it's going to be very difficult for the Mavericks to do well against Timberwolves, Bucks, 76ers in a 3-game stretch.
Well, Jim, as always, thank you for joining us here, man. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Gus. And, one quick thing I wanted to throw in, I want to start doing this every week. We don't have a good term for what the 9 and 10 spots in the play-in race are. I want to start calling that the play-in danger zone. So as part of Western Conference Wednesday, I want to be able to update that in terms of where the Pelicans are. Right now, they're 3 games ahead of 9th and 10th, which is as I have described it, the play-in danger zone. They're 3.5 games ahead of Houston, which is in 11th place right now, which is another reason why tonight's game is important, so that they can, you win your 4.5 games ahead of the Rockets, you lose it's down to 2.5. So we'll keep checking in on throughout the course of the season to see if we can get to the point where the Pelicans meet one of your goals and your hopes and dreams of not having it come down to March and April in terms of, making the play-in and being ahead of that 9th spot, which is very key. The difference between 8th and 9th, we've said it before, is just so huge.
It'd be nice. It'd
2 chances to win a game or just 1.
I'm hoping that happens. Yeah. Anyway, Jim, as always, man, appreciate it. At Jim Eichenhofer, at Jim_Eichenhofer is the way to follow over there on X. I'm Gus Kattengell. That's Jim Eichenhofer. As always, appreciate the time. We'll see you on Friday on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast. Join us 3 times per week on Pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcasts. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhofer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.